If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge. And when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the podcast. The Emergence of the Vampire Clan. The old cemetery in Murray, Kentucky held more secrets than anyone realized. Rod Ferrell walked between the weathered headstones most nights, his black coat trailing behind him. At 16, he already carried himself like someone much older, much darker. His home life crumbled around him daily. His mother, Sandra, struggled with her own demons. His father remained a distant memory. The small town whispered about the strange boy who dressed in black and spoke of things that made adults nervous. Rod found escape in a different world entirely. A game called Vampire the Masquerade became his obsession. Players pretended to be ancient bloodsuckers with supernatural powers. But for Rod, the pretending slowly stopped. He started calling himself Vasago, not Rod, not the troubled teenager from a broken home. Vasago was a 500-year-old vampire with incredible strength and wisdom. Vasago commanded respect. Other lost teenagers noticed this transformation. They saw how Rod carried himself with new confidence, how he spoke with authority about ancient powers and blood magic. These kids felt just as alone and forgotten as he once did. Sarah Remington was among the first to join him. Then came Dana Cooper. Each new member brought their own pain and desperate need to belong somewhere. Rod offered them something their families and schools never could. He offered them power. The group met in abandoned buildings and remote patches of forest. Rod taught them about vampire hierarchy and blood bonds. He explained how drinking each other's blood would connect their souls forever. The rituals started small, but grew more intense. Rod discovered he possessed a natural gift for leadership. He could read what each teenager needed to hear. He promised eternal life to those afraid of death. He offered family bonds to those abandoned by parents. He gave power to those who felt powerless. The mid-1990s provided perfect conditions for this dark fantasy to flourish. Gothic music and fashion swept through youth culture. Movies about vampires dominated theaters. Adults worried about dangerous influences, but rarely looked close enough to see real warning signs. Rod's followers began calling themselves the Vampire Clan. They created elaborate backstories about their vampire lives. They practiced blood rituals with growing frequency. What started as teenage rebellion against boring small-town life became something far more serious. The line between fantasy and reality blurred more each week. Rod spoke less about the game and more about actual vampire abilities. His followers listened with growing belief. They needed this new identity more than they needed the truth. Inside this tight circle, Rod held absolute authority. His word became law. His fantasies became their reality. The other teenagers hung on every story he told about immortal battles and supernatural vengeance. None of them could see how dangerous their game had become, how their leader's need for control grew stronger each day, how their shared secrets bound them to choices they weren't ready to make. Something darker was building in Murray, Kentucky, something that would soon spread far beyond the cemetery's iron gates. The journey to Eustis, a plan to rescue. The phone call came at midnight. Heather Wendorf's voice trembled through the receiver as she whispered her desperate plea to Rod Ferrell. She needed to escape. Her parents were cruel, she said. They didn't understand her. They were hurting her in ways that only Rod could save her from. Rod listened in the darkness of his Kentucky home. Something stirred inside him. This wasn't just a cry for help. This was his calling, his destiny. Here was a damsel in distress, hundreds of miles away in Florida, and only he could rescue her. The 16-year-old who believed he was a centuries-old vampire felt his purpose crystallize. Heather wasn't just any girl. She was special. She understood the darkness that lived within him. When they had met months earlier, she had seen past the awkward teenager from Murray, Kentucky. She had recognized the powerful being he truly was. Rod gathered his clan the next day. Dana Cooper, his devoted follower, listened with wide eyes as he explained their mission. Scott Anderson and Charity Kesey nodded along. They would travel south to save Heather from her terrible situation. But this wasn't just about rescue anymore. Rod's mind spun with grander visions. He would show Heather his true power. He would prove that the vampire persona she had glimpsed was real. This journey would be their transformation from pretend monsters into something far more dangerous. The group stole a car. Rod convinced them it was necessary. Heroes sometimes had to break rules to save innocent people. The theft felt like crossing a line, but Rod made it sound noble. They were warriors on a sacred quest. As they drove through the night toward Florida, Rod spoke constantly about Heather. She was beautiful. She was misunderstood. She needed someone strong enough to protect her. The others listened as Rod painted himself as her destined savior. Dana Cooper watched Rod's face in the rearview mirror. His obsession with Heather had grown beyond normal teenage infatuation. He spoke about her like she was already his possession. His eyes held a strange light when he described their future together. The miles passed in darkness. Ron's stories grew more elaborate with each hour. He told his followers about the power they would discover in Florida, about the life they would build with Heather, about the enemies they might have to face. None of them realized they were driving toward a nightmare. Rod's fantasy about saving Heather was about to collide with reality in ways that would destroy multiple families forever. The stolen car carried them deeper into Rod's delusion. Each mile brought them closer to a violence that would shock the nation and expose the deadly truth behind their vampire games. Rituals and initiation in the graveyard. The old cemetery stood silent under the Florida moon, its weathered headstones casting long shadows across the damp earth. Rod Ferrell led his small group through the wrought iron gates, their footsteps muffled by fallen leaves. This was the moment Heather had been waiting for, her true acceptance into the vampire clan. The teenagers gathered in a circle among the graves, their faces pale in the moonlight. Ferrell moved with purpose, pulling out a small knife that glinted silver in his hands. The others watched in hushed reverence as their leader began to speak in low, dramatic tones about blood bonds and eternal loyalty. Heather's heart pounded as she stepped forward. She had been part of their group before, but tonight felt different. Tonight would make it real. The cemetery provided the perfect backdrop for their dark theater, a place where death seemed to whisper from every corner. One by one, each member pressed the blade to their skin, letting drops of blood fall onto the cold ground. They mixed their blood together in a small cup, passing it around like communion wine. The taste was metallic and warm, sealing their pact in the most primal way they knew. Ferrell watched Heather's face carefully as she drank. He saw the fear melt away, replaced by something fiercer. She was no longer just the troubled girl seeking escape from her problems at home. Now she belonged to something bigger, something that felt powerful and dangerous. The ritual lasted only minutes, but its effect would linger much longer. As they stood among the graves, the teenagers felt transformed. They were no longer ordinary kids playing dress-up. They had become something else entirely, a family bound by shared secrets and spilled blood. The cemetery amplified every whispered word and nervous laugh. Ancient oaks creaked overhead as if approving of their ceremony. Spanish moss swayed like ghostly curtains in the humid air. Everything felt charged with meaning and possibility. But beneath the excitement, something darker was taking root. The blood ritual had crossed a line between fantasy and reality that none of them fully understood. What started as teenage rebellion and role-playing had evolved into something more serious, more binding. As they walked back through the cemetery gates, Heather felt different. The old world of high school drama and family troubles seemed far behind her now. She had found her place in Rod's strange family, and she would do anything to keep it. The moon disappeared behind clouds as they left the graveyard, plunging them into darkness. None of them realized they had just taken the first real step toward tragedy. The murders in the Wendorf home. The night of November 25th, 1996, started like any other evening in Eustis, Florida. Richard Wendorf sat in his living room, unaware that danger was approaching his front door. His wife, Naomi Ruth Queen, was nearby, going about her usual routine. Neither could have imagined what was about to happen. Rod Ferrell had made his choice. The vampire games were no longer enough. Something darker had taken hold of his mind, pushing him past the point of pretend rituals and blood-drinking ceremonies. He grabbed a crowbar and convinced Howard Scott Anderson to come with him. They walked through the quiet neighborhood toward the Wendorf house. The other clan members waited somewhere else, not knowing the full extent of what Rod planned to do. Heather Wendorf had given Rod information about her parents' schedules, but later claimed she never wanted them hurt. The truth of what she knew that night remains clouded in mystery. Rod and Howard entered the house without making much noise. They found Richard Wendorf first. What happened next was swift and brutal. Rod raised the crowbar and struck. There was no hesitation, no moment of doubt. The fantasy world he had built in his mind seemed to demand this terrible act. The sound must have alerted Naomi Ruth Queen. She came to see what was wrong and met the same fate. Two innocent people lost their lives in their own home, killed by teenagers who had lost touch with reality. The murders were over in minutes, but the consequences would last forever. Rod and Howard left the house, their hands stained with blood that was all too real. This was not the symbolic blood of their vampire rituals. This was the result of actual violence. When the other clan members learned what had happened, their reactions were mixed. Some felt shock and horror. Others seemed caught up in Rod's twisted excitement. Fear began to creep in as the reality of their situation became clear. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The vampire fantasy that had seemed so exciting and mysterious had led to real death. Two parents would never come home again. Two lives had been ended by a crowbar in the hands of a disturbed teenager. The group scrambled to figure out what to do next. They took the Wendorf's car and began to run. But where do you go when you've committed murder? How do you hide from something so terrible? The make-believe world Rod had created was crumbling. Reality was catching up fast, and it would not be kind to any of them. The manhunt and capture in Baton Rouge. The old Buick Century sputtered down Interstate 10 like a wounded animal. Rod Ferrell gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the worn plastic. In the back seat, his followers huddled together, their vampire personas cracking under the weight of what they had done. They had maybe $50 between them. The gas gauge pointed dangerously close to empty. Every police car they passed made their hearts race. This wasn't the grand escape they had imagined in their fantasy world. Scott Anderson kept looking over his shoulder. The confident vampire prince act was gone now. Real blood stained their clothes, not the theatrical kind they were used to. Charity Kesey stared out the window, silent tears cutting tracks through her pale makeup. Miles behind them, Detective Al Gusler was building the biggest case of his career. Phone calls buzzed between Florida and Louisiana police departments. The FBI had taken notice too. This wasn't just another runaway case anymore. The media caught wind fast. Local news became national headlines overnight. Parents across America watched in horror as reporters described teenagers who thought they were vampires. The story had everything the news loved: young killers, occult symbols, and a cross-country chase. But the clan was falling apart. Paranoia crept in like poison. Every gas station stop felt like a trap. Every stranger's glance seemed suspicious. The group that once felt invincible now jumped at shadows. Rod tried to hold them together, but doubt gnawed at him too. The murders felt different now. Real. Permanent. The victims weren't characters in some game. They were actual people with actual families who would never see them again. In Baton Rouge, Heather Wendorf's grandmother made a choice that would end everything. She picked up the phone and called the police. Her granddaughter was with these killers, and she couldn't stay quiet anymore. The tip came in on November 29th. Police surrounded a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. The vampire clan's journey was over before they even knew they were surrounded. When the officers knocked, there was no dramatic standoff, no final battle between good and evil, just tired teenagers who looked nothing like the monsters the media had painted them as. They surrendered without a fight. Rod Ferrell, the self-proclaimed vampire leader who had promised his followers eternal darkness, sat in handcuffs as morning sunlight streamed through the motel window. The fantasy was over. Reality had finally caught up. Confessions, trials, and sentencing. The cold interrogation room held secrets that would soon spill into the harsh fluorescent light. Rod Ferrell sat across from detectives, his pale hands fidgeting on the metal table. What came next shocked even seasoned investigators. Without lawyers present, without hesitation, the 16-year-old began to speak. His voice was calm, almost matter-of-fact, as he described the brutal murders of Richard and Ruth Wendorf. He told them about the crowbar, about the blood, about crossing into what he called the other side. But his reasons made little sense to anyone listening. Ferrell spoke of vampire clans and spiritual awakening. He claimed the killings were necessary for his transformation into an immortal being. The detectives exchanged glances, unsure whether they were dealing with genuine delusion or calculated manipulation. News of the confessions spread quickly through Murray, Kentucky, and beyond. Camera crews arrived. Reporters filled hotel rooms. The small town had never seen anything like the media circus that followed. The courtroom became a stage where experts battled over Ferrell's mind. Psychiatrists testified about his troubled childhood, his obsession with role-playing games, and his belief in vampires. Defense attorneys argued he was mentally ill, a damaged teenager who couldn't tell fantasy from reality. Prosecutors painted a different picture. They described a cold-blooded killer who knew exactly what he was doing. They pointed to his detailed confession, his planning, his ability to manipulate others. The crowbar strikes, they argued, were deliberate and vicious. The other clan members faced their own reckonings. Heather Wendorf, whose parents had died, received a lighter sentence after cooperating with authorities. Dana Cooper and Charity Kesey, the youngest members, were treated as juveniles despite their involvement in the horrific crime. Scott Anderson, Ferrell's closest companion, received life in prison. The boy who had followed his leader into darkness would never see freedom again. When the judge sentenced Rod Ferrell to death, he became the youngest person on death row in the United States. The courtroom fell silent as the words echoed through the packed chamber. Families wept. Jurors looked haunted by their decision. Years later, appeals would reduce his sentence to life without parole. The death penalty seemed too harsh for someone so young, even for crimes so terrible. But questions remained unanswered. Had violent games and occult materials shaped a killer? Or was Ferrell already broken, drawn to darkness that existed within him? The legal system had delivered its verdict, but the deeper mystery of what creates such evil remained as puzzling as ever. The legacy, media, public fear, and lasting uncertainty. The cameras arrived within hours of the arrest. News vans lined the quiet streets of Eustis, Florida, as reporters scrambled to make sense of what had happened. A teenager claiming to be a vampire had murdered his girlfriend's parents. The story was too strange to ignore. Television producers saw gold in Rod Ferrell's case. Here was everything that terrified parents in the 1990s. Violent video games, dark music, kids dressed in black, role-playing games that blurred the line between fantasy and reality. The media feast began immediately. Talk shows brought on experts who had never met Rod or his followers. They spoke with authority about vampire cults and teenage Satanism. Magazine covers screamed warnings about the dangers lurking in suburban basements. Parents watched in horror as commentators described blood-drinking rituals and midnight cemetery gatherings. But something troubling happened in the rush to explain. Facts mixed with fiction. Real details from the case blended with wild theories about underground networks of teenage vampires. The actual Rod Ferrell, a confused, abused boy seeking belonging, disappeared behind the monster the media created. The case sparked nationwide panic about youth subcultures. Schools banned certain types of clothing and music. Parents searched their children's rooms for signs of occult involvement. Support groups formed for families worried about losing their kids to dangerous influences. Yet serious questions remained buried beneath the hysteria. What role did Heather Wendorf really play? Her actions that night still puzzle investigators. Did she manipulate Rod into committing murder? Or was she truly an innocent victim of his obsession? The psychological factors behind the group's formation continue to baffle experts. How does a lonely teenager become convinced he's an ancient vampire? What draws others to follow such beliefs? The answers remain elusive. Rod's childhood trauma clearly shaped his desperate search for identity and power. But thousands of children suffer abuse without forming cults or committing murder. What made his case different? Mental health professionals offer theories, but no definitive explanations. The story refuses to fade from public memory. Documentary filmmakers return to it repeatedly. True crime podcasts dissect every detail. Online forums debate Heather's guilt or innocence decades later. Perhaps the case endures because it represents our deepest fears about young people. We worry about losing them to influences we cannot understand or control. Rod Ferrell embodied those anxieties perfectly. A child transformed into something monstrous by forces his parents failed to recognize. The truth remains fractured and incomplete. We know what happened that November night, but we may never fully understand why. Some mysteries offer only partial answers, leaving us to wonder about the darkness that can grow in isolation and feed on fantasy until it becomes terrifyingly real.